Happy Thursday night. Thanks for being with us tonight. The 1976 Republican National Convention was contested, quite dramatically contested. Gerald Ford was the incumbent Republican president at that time, but he was seen as a very weak incumbent. Not only had President Gerald Ford never been elected president, he'd never been elected vice president either. Heading into that 1976 convention, the last presidential election had, of course, been 1972, when Richard Nixon won re-election along with his vice presidential running mate, Spiro Agnew. But then shortly thereafter, basically right after they won that election and were sworn in to start their second term in 1973, shortly thereafter, Vice President Spiro Agnew came under investigation for bribery. Now, this was before Watergate and all of that other mishigas, but Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, got investigated for bribery. He ended up getting criminally charged, and he had to resign from office. He had to resign the vice presidency. And we sort of forget this now, I think, because of the way the Nixon administration ended. But even before Nixon himself became the great scandal of the Nixon era, his vice president really did have to resign in disgrace and face criminal charges. And, you know, the vice presidency may not be the most crucial job in the federal government, but there does have to be somebody holding that position. So when Spiro Agnew had to go into that criminal cloud, right, and leave the vice presidency, President Nixon then had to choose someone to replace him as vice president. And that is how a congressman from Michigan, who had never been elected by an electorate larger than his single congressional district back home, nevertheless got himself into place to himself ascend to the presidency when Nixon had to resign himself because of Watergate. That is how we got incumbent President Gerald Ford, even though Gerald Ford had never been nationally elected to anything. And that is how we got the contested Republican National Convention in 1976, when Gerald Ford decided to run nationally to try to hold on to this position in the Oval Office that he had arrived at through such unexpected and undemocratic means. Because of that series of backdoors that Gerald Ford took to the presidency, Gerald Ford that year in 76, he didn't really get the deference that is typically afforded to an incumbent president. And although he was still the frontrunner for the Republican presidential nomination that year, he was such a weak frontrunner that an upstart conservative named Ronald Reagan very nearly took the presidential nomination from President Ford at the party's 1976 convention in Kansas City. That 1976 convention was a little bit nuts. There was a lot of confusion on the floor among the delegates. There were long and impossible to follow fights over seemingly arcane rules that ended up being crucial to how the delegates would vote and who they would pick. President Ford may have been a weak frontrunner and an accidental president, but he was still president. For that 1976 convention, he was not above using things like flights on Air Force One and promised visits to the White House, basically as bribes to get convention delegates to support him. So 1976 was a little nutty. 1976 was the last time the Republican Party had a contested national convention. And that's basically what everybody's expecting to be replayed this summer, but worse, when this year's contested Republican convention unfolds in Cleveland. But back at the last contested convention in 1976, there are basically two really important world-changing outcomes that were the result of that contested convention. And the first one was the obvious one, which is that Gerald Ford beat Ronald Reagan, he got the nomination, and then he went on to lose the general election to Jimmy Carter. Second result of that convention, though, was that even though Ronald Reagan didn't succeed in knocking off Gerald Ford in 76, his effort to do so in 76 and how close he got to it in 76, that did lay excellent groundwork for Ronald Reagan 4 years later to take over leadership of the Republican Party much more easily. And in 1980, when Republicans convened for their next convention in Detroit, that Republican convention in 1980, not only was that not a fight, it was an absolute coronation. Reagan had put his chief rival for the nomination that year, George Bush. He put him on the ticket with him as his running mate. There was a little noise that maybe Reagan was going to pick a Southern segregationist like Jesse Helms as his running mate, but that was only a little bit of noise. It was a pretty smooth decision, actually, and the vice presidency went to Poppy Bush, which was a very tidy way, a very unifying way to end the competition from the Republican primary that year. They had also set up the rules at that 1980 convention, so only one name could be put in nomination, so there was no drama over that. Another Reagan challenger named John Anderson, he had fought hard that year to get a speaking slot at the Republican convention, but the Republican Party and the Reagan campaign forces figured out a way to box John Anderson out of that, so he didn't get to speak, so it was a no-drama occasion. 76 had been crazy. 80 was not crazy. Ronald Reagan at the 1980 convention, he got 97% of the delegate votes that were cast that year. It was just as smooth as glass. They cast their votes. They formally nominated him. He gave his acceptance speech. The convention was seen as a huge, smoothly run success in 1980. And then the first thing that Ronald Reagan did thereafter, the first thing he did after winning the nomination in that perfectly orchestrated, micromanaged, tightly scripted pageant, the first thing he did as the newly minted Republican presidential nominee of 1980 was to go here, to go 800 miles south-southwest from that convention in Detroit to an out-of-the-way place that is hard to get to, that had no national political significance as a location, other than the one thing that town and that county were famous for. And again, this was 1980. One of the things going on in presidential politics that year was that 1980 was the first presidential election since 1960. First presidential election in 20 years, in which Alabama's segregationist governor, George Wallace, was not a candidate in one primary or another or in the general election. George Wallace had been running a segregationist campaign for president for so many years. He ran in 64, he ran in 68, he ran in 72, he ran in 76. 1980 was the first one in which George Wallace was finally not going to be a factor, having run in the previous 4 presidential elections. And when Ronald Reagan became the Republican nominee for president that year in 1980, he had to make a decision about where to start his general election campaign. And he made a decision that was widely seen at the time as basically Ronald Reagan's attempt to lock up any stray remaining George Wallace votes that might still be out there in the country. Ronald Reagan had run in 1976 and again in 80 as basically an insurgent conservative force within the Republican Party. He wasn't a Gerald Ford Republican. He wasn't a Nelson Rockefeller Republican. He was campaigning for president as somebody who was promising to not just bring the country to the right, he was promising to bring the Republican Party significantly to the right. Nobody knew if that kind of campaign would work at a national level, but if it was going to work, everybody knew that Ronald Reagan was going to need every single conservative vote in the country. And George Wallace voters had been a very specific kind of conservative for the previous 4 presidential elections. And so in 1980, with George Wallace finally and completely out of the presidential running for the first time in 20 years, there was a strategic decision made to try to make sure the Republican nominee in 1980 would be able to mop up votes from any of the people left in the country who had favored that segregationist candidate, George Wallace, in all those previous elections in which he had run, but who maybe might have felt in 1980 like they didn't have a candidate anymore now that Wallace wasn't running again for the first time in 2 decades. So Ronald Reagan didn't go campaign in his home state of California after he won the nomination. He didn't rush off to some obvious swing state. Ronald Reagan's first stop after the convention, the place he started his general election campaign, was Mississippi. Specifically, it was Neshoba County, Mississippi, which was nationally famous, which is nationally famous still today, and was certainly nationally famous at the time, for exactly one thing. Neshoba County, Philadelphia, Mississippi, is where James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman were lynched by the Klan in 1964, and where local law enforcement participated in their racist murders and then covered it up. I mean, the reason they make movies about that case, the reason Chaney, Schwerner, and Goodman are still household names today, the reason that story is so, incredible and emotionally heartrending, and there's still such intense national storytelling about that triple murder is not just because of the horror of that crime, it's because of the critical and dramatic fact that local law enforcement was fine with it. Local law enforcement was in on it. And it took the federal government basically to go down and force themselves into Neshoba County, Mississippi, in order to solve those murders, even just to find the bodies. Because under local authority in Neshoba County, Mississippi, it was not otherwise going to happen. And on August 3rd, 1980, right after he was made the presidential nominee of the Republican Party, Neshoba County, Mississippi is where Ronald Reagan went to start his presidential campaign. He went to Neshoba County on a hot, sweaty day in August, and he told a crowd of 30,000 wildly enthusiastic white Mississippians, quote, "I believe in states' rights." He stood in front of that all-white, huge, screaming crowd of tens of thousands in Mississippi and said that the federal government had too much power, that if he became president, he would rein in that federal overreach and, quote, he would restore to the states and local communities those functions which properly belong there. I believe in states' rights. Andrew Goodman had lasted precisely one day in that town before the Klan murdered him, along with his fellow civil rights activists. Those three young men were murdered in June 1964. The town did not cough up their bodies until August. When Ronald Reagan stood up on that stage in Neshoba County 16 years later, in August, at that time, some of the co-conspirators in that triple murder were still being protected in that town. As the newly minted Republican presidential nominee of 1980 went down to that town, showed up at the county fair, spoke to an all-white audience, and said not one word about the murders that town was nationally famous for, and instead whipped that sea of 30,000 white faces into a frenzy and preached states' rights to them and told them that he was their candidate. That was 1980. In 2008, in the presidential election that year, the country elected our first African-American president. That election was November 4th, 2008. November 4th, 2008, of course, was a Tuesday. Election's always on a Tuesday. But then that same week, 4 days later, on Saturday of that same week, a group of teenagers from a county called Suffolk County in New York went out in the very early morning hours with a BB gun. Their plan was to try to find a Hispanic immigrant somewhere in their town and shoot at that person with a BB gun. And they found a Hispanic man sitting on his porch, not doing anything, not bothering anybody, and they shot him multiple times with that BB gun. Later that day, the same group added a few more friends, and they went out again looking for Hispanic immigrants to attack. In the town of Patchogue, they found a Hispanic man walking on the street, rolling his bicycle along. Teenagers got out of their car, started screaming racist slurs at him. They circled him. They eventually all started beating and kicking him. They did not kill him. The man was able to get away, but that group was not done. Later that same night, the same group went out again looking for another Hispanic immigrant to try to terrorize and attack. They found two Hispanic men walking near the train station in the same town where they had earlier beaten up the guy with the bike. And again, this group, they surrounded these men who they'd found on the street or were doing nothing to them, doing nothing wrong, but they had the misfortune of being Hispanic in this particular town. They beat them. They called them racist names. They attacked them. And this time, one of those two men they were attacking, they did kill him. One of the men who they attacked, a 37-year-old man who worked at a local dry cleaners, they stabbed him in the chest, killed him. And then the national story at that point in our country, that week, the week of November 4th, 2008, and what was going on in the country right now, what we were all thinking about in terms of race in our country right now was, wow, we're the country who just elected a black president. But in New York, the local story was Suffolk County and these racist attacks, these escalating racist attacks that had suddenly but probably inevitably turned fatal. In the wake of that murder, this hate crime murder, this murder came at the end of a beating by 7 teenagers. The local Hispanic population started reporting that this was the culmination of what had been years of these kinds of organized attacks, unprovoked, racist, predatory attacks. A few months after the murder, the New York Times published 10 pages of accounts of racist, unprovoked attacks on Hispanics in that town and in the immediately surrounding towns. People beaten badly enough to need surgery, people beaten with baseball bats, beaten with belts and chains, all completely unprovoked attacks. And again and again and again, with each of these attacks, the story of the police was that the police just seemed not to care. Eventually, in 2009, the Federal Department of Justice investigated the local police for discriminatory policing, discouraging Latino victims from filing complaints, failing to investigate crimes against Latinos, failing to investigate hate crimes involving Latinos, the raw number of hate crimes against Latinos in this county. The Justice Department eventually entered into an oversight agreement with the county police department. The county police department agreed to cooperate. That all happened in a place called Suffolk County, New York. The epicenter of these hate crimes and these racist attacks, including the police seeming to not care about these racist attacks, the epicenter was a little town called Patchogue in Suffolk County. And I mean, it's a little town, 12,000 people. It's a kind of out-of-the-way place. It has no national political significance whatsoever, other than this thing from a few years ago for which it is sort of famous. What it's famous for is the racist targeting of Hispanic immigrants to the point of murder. And today, that town, that little town of 12,000 people, is where Donald Trump decided to campaign. He didn't just go to Suffolk County, and he didn't just go to Patchogue. He decided to campaign today on the street where 37-year-old Marcelo Lucero was beaten and then stabbed to death by a racist mob that attacked him specifically because he was a Hispanic immigrant.
The message from Hispanic advocates is clear. Donald Trump should not appear at a Patchogue venue on the same street where immigrant Marcelo Lucero was killed in a headline-making 2008 hate crime. 21-year Patchogue resident Maria Avasila says she remembers when immigrants were beaten routinely here, and she worries that Trump's visit will start the violence again.
I'm really afraid because I don't want this bad things happen.
Donald Trump is the front runner, so we welcome him to Suffolk County.
The chairman of Suffolk's Republican Party says he has no plan to move or postpone the Trump appearance.
A little news report from last night. Today, the Suffolk County Republican Party went ahead with this invitation they'd extended to Donald Trump to campaign on the same street as that fatal hate crime, immediately adjacent to that fatal hate crime site, literally a couple hundred yards from where that young man died. Mr. Trump was introduced at that event by former Republican candidate for New York governor, Carl Palladino. This is how he introduced him.
By any chance, does anybody in this room know if we're going to build a wall? Are we going to build a wall? And who's going to pay for that wall? Is that right? The New Yorkers are with Donald Trump all the way. Because he speaks truth. And because he doesn't fear. We're going to build that wall? Is Mexico going to pay for it? One more time. Who's going to build that wall? And who's going to pay for that wall? Thank you. Donald, God bless America and God bless Donald Trump for facing these people.
We're going to have strong borders. We're going to have a wall. The wall's going to be built. You, of course, know who's paying for the wall, right? Who's paying? We're going to build a wall. Who's going to pay for that wall? 100%. John is predicting this is going to be my single biggest margin. Suffolk, this whole area. He better be right. He better be right.
Patchogue's history of racist and fatal hate crimes against Latino immigrants. It's not necessarily a nationally famous story, but it is a New York famous story. Donald Trump has not yet won the Republican nomination. He's still trying to win the New York primary, but campaigning in Patchogue today on the street where Marcelo Lucero was murdered, it means something specific in New York. And local activists, local editorial boards have been begging Suffolk County Republicans and Donald Trump to please not do this. The New York Times editorial board called it a disgraceful provocation by both Trump and local Republicans for inviting him, but he did it. And he was greeted by a very enthusiastic, screaming, almost entirely white crowd inside. while a more diverse group of protesters outside expressed themselves as well. Tonight, Mr. Trump and other Republican candidates for president are at the New York State Republican Gala in Midtown Manhattan, where yet more protesters are outside trying to be a counterpoint to what those candidates stand for. You know, and protests are part of politicking. And this nomination is not yet sewn up by anyone. But in presidential politicking, symbolism is a deliberate choice. And racial provocation is something with a deep and resonant history. And it is one thing to do that as a small fry politician. It is another thing to do it as a frontrunner for a major party's presidential nomination. Being a presidential frontrunner is a powerful thing. It can also be a dangerous thing if you want it to be.